My name is John Tweedale. I have the joy of serving as the VP of Academics at Reformation Bible College, and I am joined here tonight by my dear friend, Dr. Bob Godfrey, who is, of course, a teaching fellow and chair of the board here at Ligonier Ministries, and for a number of years he served as the president and professor of church history at Westminster Seminary in California. Tonight, in this seminar, we are going to be thinking about the value of church history for Christian living. And our topic tonight, pressing forward by looking back, comes from an article, Dr. Godfrey, that you wrote a couple of years ago for Table Talk.
John just reminded me of that today. I had completely forgotten that that was true, but I'm glad you remember. This crowd has a sort of lean and hungry look, don't you think?
They do. Well, we won't be long, but you know, that's what historians do, is that we help people remember what they've written here.
Good point.
Yes.
Good point. And I had a dear colleague in California who would have said of a crowd like this is the select of the elect.
Okay.
So, you know, this is
a special crowd.
Creme de la creme. Yes, exactly.
Well, you open your article by saying that we live in an age of profound cultural change. We feel like the ground is moving underneath our feet. Well, one profound way we see this shift is in the anti-historical sentiment that pervades modern culture. So we live in a day that is anti-historical. We think, what is new is inherently better than what is old. So why are we here tonight thinking about history? What is the value of history for being a Christian today?
Well, people who don't know any history don't know where they've come from, they don't know how they've gotten here, and they most of the time don't know where they're going. So it's a pretty deplorable state of reality because we are so shaped by those who came before us, and if we don't have some awareness of that, we really don't know our own character, much less our own history, and so it's crucial. I read a statistic recently that in many of the American universities, the study of history is in radical decline, and I think it's really dangerous for the Republic, for people not to know how we were shaped, what were the ideals as a country that shaped us, and of course, as a church, that's true as well. So, as Luther said, you cannot heap too much praise on historians.
Amen. Amen. Well, one of the challenges, though, for those of us who actually do love history is that we can almost focus entirely on the past and, strange enough, neglect the present. So what are things that we can say about our modern age that are unique and perhaps even positive for us as Christians today?
Well, I think every age does have its own moment in the sun. Every age is given to us by God to serve Him in the present. And it is a mistake to get wrapped up in some kind of nostalgia, often sentimental about the past, which usually isn't realistic in any case. My wife used to say that if the 16th century ever came back, I was ready, and I would always respond by saying, well, it's a very good century, but nonetheless, it's not the century we're called to live in. And so we want to be aware of our own unique circumstances, which I do think involve a rather sharp break from the past. And I think it's going to require some quite serious Christian rethinking about what is the world in which we live and how do we relate to it.
So I want to dig deep into that idea of rethinking our own cultural moment. And in the article that you wrote, you feature one figure in particular, a man by the name of Abraham Kuyper, who was both Reformed, but also incredibly modern. And so who was Abraham Kuyper, and why is he in particular important for us to think about as we're trying to press forward today by looking at the past?
Did you warn these people we're going to talk about Abraham Kuyper?
I gave them no warning at all.
You know, they may now prefer dinner, and that would be okay. Abraham Kuyper, I think, was a remarkably important figure in the modern history of Christianity. He was born in 1837, so he's not all that modern. He lived down to 1920. But he very perceptively saw that the West was in dramatic change, earlier in Europe probably than in America. And he was convinced that Christians needed to rethink their understanding of the relationship of Christianity to culture generally and particularly to the state. That the days of Christianity being the values that were widely accepted in the culture and enforced legally by the state were coming to an end, and he thought, for the sake of Christianity, that was not entirely a bad thing, that Christianity was going to have to go it on its own, if you will, in the modern world, and it was going to be able to go it on its own in a more purified way than in terms of the accommodations it had often had to make to the state in the past.
One of the things that Kuyper helps us think about is the importance of having a public faith. Now, we live in a day that very much discourages public expressions of faith. And on the one hand, you have those who think, well, just keep your faith to yourself. Others are more aggressive and will say that your faith is absolutely irrelevant and it expresses intolerance. So how do we think as Christians today about the importance of public expressions of faith, and how is that important to our witness as Christians?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, because we are under tremendous pressure to privatize our faith. And the culture around us says, well, you can believe any crazy thing you want to believe, but keep it to yourself. If you speak out about it, especially in any public sphere, then you're engaged in micro or macro aggressions against people, and they'll be wounded and their feelings will be hurt, and this will be, you know, the end of civilization as we know it. And Kuyper was one who said, we ought to live in a society where people are free to express their ideas and to try to give some institutional form to those ideas, and to do so respectfully, to do so carefully, thoughtfully, but nonetheless, we as Christians have as much right as anyone to speak up for our faith, our beliefs, and what we see as the implication of those beliefs for the world in which we live.
So I want to come back to that idea of institutions and institution building. Kuyper is probably most famous for this idea of sphere sovereignty, and I'll have you define sphere sovereignty, but think about it in this way. In our own day, we are faced with several options as Christians. On the one hand, we've already talked about radical individualism. On the other hand, you have extreme statism or nationalism. And for many of us, we think those are the only two options. But Kuyper presents another way, what he calls sphere sovereignty. So how does sphere sovereignty help us think about our role today as Christians in the modern world?
Well, Kuyper, from the perspective of the late 19th century, said as we look out on the development of Western thought, you see two tendencies in Western thought, and they're all related to the question, where do rights come from? There was a lot of talk in the 19th century about rights. And Kuyper said, the dominant thinking of the West has become rights either come from the state, so the state has all power and it grants to people in the state rights, or we argue that the individual has all authority and power and all rights, and the individual concedes some rights to others, including, for example, the state. And Kuyper saw in the United States a great example of the powerful influence of individualism. And he really almost prophetically anticipates the rise of communism and fascism on into the 20th century, where the state claimed all authority. And Kuyper said, we as Christians have to bear witness to our conviction that rights do not come from the state and rights do not come from the individual. Rights come from God. And it may be that lots of people don't believe that. It may be that lots of people will deny it. But we as Christians need to bear witness to rights coming from God and to press on people that if you deny that, you're going to end up with some kind of very destructive tyranny. And Kuyper said, instead of seeing all rights vested either in the state or in the individual, we have to see that rights are given by God to the institutions he has created. And so Kuyper stressed the family as an institution God created, the church as an institution God created, the state an institution God created, other things as well. And he said, we have to insist that the family is not created by the state, the family is not created by the individual, the family is created by God. And the family can flourish only in that context where the family is defined by God, established by God, and is accountable ultimately to God.
That's great. Chris opened the conference today by talking about our desire to encourage you. And we think that Kuyper's approach here is one resource to encourage you. As you think about your role, whether it's in the family or in the church or in the state, or maybe you work in education or in business or the arts, Kuyper provides a model for us to be faithful witnesses for Christ as we do good work in society in each of those spheres. And so we would commend to you Kuyper's, say, lectures on Calvinism, where he thinks about this idea of sphere sovereignty in these various domains.
And Kuyper lived that out in remarkable ways in his own life, so that as a young man, he was ordained to the ministry and then felt called to serve God in the Parliament of the Netherlands, and eventually became, for 4 years, Prime Minister of the Netherlands, in addition to helping to reform the church and to establish a political party and establish a university and establish various newspaper publications. So he was really a kind of universal man in all sorts of spheres of life. And so what he wrote about in his lectures on Calvinism, which he delivered at the end of the 19th century at Princeton University, are really thoughtful and challenging to think through serving God across the spectrum of life.
One of the things that you bring out in your article is you talk about the importance of change. Certainly as Christians, we want to see people changed. We want them to know the transforming power of the gospel. You actually make this point that it's important for us as Christians to view change through the lens of Reformation and not through the lens of revolution. So why is Reformation a better paradigm for change than revolution?
Well, I've been thinking about that relative to the protests we've seen recently in American universities about foreign policy and Israel and Gaza and the very concerning suffering in those places. And it struck me to try to do a Kuyperian analysis that what's been going on on the campuses of the anti-Israeli protests are very much an expression of a revolutionary attitude that says we are going to protest, we are going to force change, we don't need to listen to anybody, we don't need to talk to anybody, we will simply rise up and force the change. And of course, Kuyper had seen that happening in Europe in the late 18th on into the 19th century. He had seen the French Revolution and the violence that followed in the terror. He had seen the uprisings in 1848 in Europe, and this idea that the way forward is to tear down, to tear apart, and then to completely rebuild on a different basis. And Kuyper said that revolutionary attitude of tearing down, starting over, rebuilding from scratch is just un-Christian. God has given us history. Providence has shaped us. Back to history again. And Kuyper said, what we need is reformation. Of course we need change. Of course human society can be improved, but the way forward is not through violence, but the way forward is through reflection, through reasonable discussion, where we listen to one another, where we respect one another, and where we reach some kind of agreement to pursue change together. It's a very different vision of society and of progress.
So, follow up on that question, on that point. Kuyper, on the one hand, talked about this idea of antithesis, where he drew a distinction between Christian and non-Christian. But on the other hand, he also talked about common grace, and that category common grace helps many of us as we go back, from a Ligonier conference where we're around other Christians, and then we go home, and now we've got to work with many non-Christians. And so what is common grace, and how does that help us as we think about a category of witness and reformation?
Kuyper wanted very much not to compromise any of the biblical revelation. And so he said part of biblical revelation is that there is a radical difference, a radical antithesis, he called it, between Christians who are regenerated by the Spirit of God and because of the Spirit of God have a new life and a new understanding of truth, and the unregenerate who have no such understanding of truth from God. And Kuyper said we don't want to compromise that in any way, but at the same time we want to recognize that there is a general humanity that God in his kindness preserves so that we as human beings do not descend into the very worst kind of life that we could have. And he said it's not because there's an area of life unaffected by sin, which he thought was the mistake of some of Roman Catholic natural law reasoning. He said we're all equally affected by sin, but God restrains the effect of sin so that we can find common grounds of cooperation with unregenerate people to pursue certain goals. And I think one historic example of that in America was opposition to abortion. Christians opposed abortion for their biblical reasons, but were willing to cooperate with Orthodox Jews or Muslims or others, secularists, who opposed abortion for their own reasons, but because of God's restraining grace had come to the conclusion that unrestricted abortion was wrong, and we could cooperate then on that specific goal. So that was very much Kuyper's idea. We may not be able to cooperate on everything all the time, but we can find specific areas where we can cooperate and try to move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Godfrey. Dear friends, if you have been encouraged by this topic and want to read more, let me encourage you to go to Table Talk Online and type in the search engine there, pressing forward by looking back. And as you consider the life of Abraham Kuyper, we trust that you will be encouraged to live a faithful Christian life wherever God has called you and wherever sphere he has placed you. May you be faithful as you seek to honor and glorify God where he has you. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.